suburbs and Woodside Park in West Philadelphia had one thing in common. They were built and operated by the transportation companies to provide more reasons for riding the streetcars.
The Fairmount Park Transportation Company went into business in 1896. They built the Strawberry Mansion Bridge across the Schuylkill River. That was built as part of the construction of the Fairmount Park trolley line. It was very much a warm weather attraction, very much associated with Woodside Park.
For the first half of this century, Philadelphia was a trolley town. By the 1920s, the city boasted a fleet of 2,000 streetcars, which rode on more than 550 miles of track. In Center City, Market, Arch, Chestnut, and Walnut Streets all were lined with trolley tracks, as well as every numbered street from Front to 23rd. In those days, streetcars were the last word in travel.
The car that we're on was built immediately after World War II and was part of a sort of standard model of streetcar that was developed and produced for perhaps 24 cities throughout the United States. The cars came in many different models. Some people may remember cars that were what are known as double end, with operating controls at both ends. And either end could be the front or the rear. As you might imagine, in the days before the widespread use of automobiles, getting a group to and from a funeral was a bit involved, and especially getting to and from the cemetery. So many transit systems, Philadelphia amongst them, provided a service where a special streetcar was fitted out for use by funerals. The car had a large hatch in the side to allow placing the coffin inside the car, and then the car was run to the nearest point to the cemetery from the funeral home. The car was known as the Hillside.
Following the Second World War, streetcar ridership began to decline all over the country once automobiles became more available and gasoline was derationed. Tucker has a theory about all of this, and it's nothing if not provocative.
There was a conspiracy to buy up useful rail transit properties and destroy them. And that firm was known as the National City Lines Company. They were owned by the General Motors Corporation, Firestone Tire and Rubber, and some oil companies, and took over the Philadelphia Transportation Company and sold almost as many assets as we still have today in the SEPTA system. Several car houses and garages were closed, sold off a lot of vehicles, and so forth. This was part of a nationwide program to reduce the availability of public transportation and thereby sell more automobiles.
There are still a few trolley lines operating in Philadelphia, and they're kept rolling by a dedicated army of maintenance workers in depots all over the city, like this one at 58th and Calla Streets in West Philadelphia. Men like Bob Hughes and his staff are fond of the old PCC, or President's cars, just like the one we just rode on. They're sturdy and reliable, but have been phased out in recent years by the more streamlined LRV, or light rail vehicle. In fact, the last PCC car rolled out of the barn in September 1992 and into the memories of those who rode and worked on them for over 40 years. Railroad. Day after day, giant steam trains brought thousands of passengers through its portals into the center of town. They called this castle Broad Street Station. Actually, Broad Street Station was two different structures combined to form one grand terminal. The first building dated to 1882, designed by the Wilson brothers, architects of the famous Centennial Exposition of 1876. It was a station designed in the European style, Within a few years, it became taxed beyond its capacity. And as the railroad planned an expansion, it turned to the master of the Philadelphia style.
They hired Frank Furness, who is now a very famous Philadelphia architect. After many years of eclipse, he was commissioned to design the building in red brick and terracotta. So they built a 10-story building. So they had a 4-story building, built a 10-story building. And there are wonderful photographs of that building. I think it was one of the greatest Victorian masterpieces I've ever seen, personally. It stood for 70 years, in that condition from 1893 to 1952.
The number of tracks coming into Broad Street Station expanded to 16, which required an enormous shed to cover them. The design was determined by utility and competition.
And so they went ahead and built this huge train shed, and one of the things that they made a point to do was to top the Reading. The idea of the Reading Railroad doing anything bigger or on a grander scale than the Pennsylvania was absolutely unthinkable. The train shed of the Reading is, I believe, about 300 feet even. And Pennsylvania made it a point, therefore, to do a train shed which was 306 feet wide, topping the Reading by 6 feet. And so the world learned that the Pennsylvania was indeed the Colossus. And when you would go into this train shed, it was an overwhelming sight to see this huge vault over all of these engines that were puffing away. And remember, this was the day of the choo-choo. There was no electric train yet. There was nothing in the way of diesel. This was all good old-fashioned coal. While they had skylights and ventilators and whatnot, the place was just coal dust incorporated. So you went in and you saw this scene of all of these trains puffing away, and then the coal dust, which would get in your ears and in your eyes a little bit. And it was quite an experience to go along and to see this thing.
By 1910, 578 trains entered and exited Broad Street Station every day, making it the most desirable destination of the train riding public, not only for transportation, but for socializing. One such spot was the Savarin Restaurant.
The Savarin Restaurant was always a mecca for business luncheons. And again, it was so well located. It was right across the street from City Hall and near most of the main office buildings at the time. And people would make dates to have lunch and talk business, and also if you wanted to butter somebody up and show them that you held them in particular high regard, you took them to lunch at the Savarin.
Chuck has done what I think is the ultimate tribute to Broad Street Station, and that's this fantastic model. In fact, it's so fantastic, I can't even believe it.
Well, it's a little project that I got involved in.
Yeah.
My parents go to church with a friend named Harry Albrecht, and he had a little book on Broad Street Station. My brother's in the trains. I said, boy, this would be great to make an end scale. And without thinking about where it was going to go, I started building, and that was about 7 years ago.
Oh my God, a labor of love.
There was a small part that I did build last night, the land bridge, which we go across the street, and I spent probably 30 hours working on
That's kind of fun.
on the little land bridge, and that's just a small piece about 7.5 inches long by about 3 inches. And there were no plans, so I had to draw all the plans myself from photographs. It's still being built. There's always little details to add and update as photographs give you more information, but this will probably continue being built for years to come.
Broad Street Station's grand train shed was indeed impressive, but it was also a fire waiting to happen. The shed's grease and oil-soaked wood flooring, the storage rooms beneath the tracks, and the cavernous space created by the vaulted roof combined to create a firefighter's nightmare. On June 10th, 1923, that nightmare became a reality. At 11 p.m., the floor began to smolder, and by the time the fire department arrived, the shed was engulfed in flames. 200 passengers in a Boston-bound train were trapped inside